My name is Jocelyn Hurtado. I am the archivist at the Black Archives History Research Foundation of South Florida, and I am excited. Today I'm going to talk about the Liberty Square Housing Project. This is part of the Safer Home Black Archive series. My series is called Is It True? Tales from Black Miami, and I discuss different stories, different information, different parts of history of Black Miami, and see what is true, what is not, and just basically go from there. So I'm gonna get started. So today's session of Is It True? Tales from Black Miami is it true that the second housing project in the United States was Liberty Square? And the answer to that, short answer to it, is yes. The second housing project in the United States was Liberty Square. And I am excited to dive into this story because this story has many different parts and components. And in order to talk about Liberty Square, you first have to talk about Color Town. You need to talk about the living conditions that were experienced in Color Town in the 1930s. But just a brief recap, just to start it off. First things first, you need to know that when Miami was incorporated in 1896, the area west to the Florida East Coast Railroad line was designated as the color section, the color town of Miami. And this due to Jim Crow laws. This was where the colored population was forced to live in and designated. So this already boundary restriction actually allowed this community to create a self-sustaining community. Within Color Town, there were Black-owned shops, lounges, clubs, theaters, restaurants, and everything like that. But because of the confinement of Jim Crow laws, soon, really quickly, there was an overpopulation and density problem. And by the 1930s, the health conditions in Color Town began to worsen. And that was mostly due because of the white city officials in the city of Miami did not do anything to basically meet the basic requirements for its colored residents. There was no running water, there was no running electricity, there was no sewer lines or anything like that in the color section of Color Town. So when you have all these different components, what do you get? You see an increase of diseases. There was outbreaks of typhoid, tuberculosis, dengue, yellow fever, and because of this created a real big public health crisis. And I'm actually going to talk to you about a couple people who brought this situation to light, and that was Reverend John E. Comer and then also Kelsey E. Farr. They knew they needed to do something because these white city officials were not going to do anything about it. So what happened was John E. Comer decided to solicit the aid of a writer from the Miami Herald in order to do an expose on the living conditions in the area. And because basically they were not going to do anything, so why not bring it to national headlines? Why not make it like the only way that you can get people to realize what a crisis this was basically to put in today in a public national platform. And the argument, the way that he pitched it was you need to the city officials, you need to do something about this, because the same people who are cooking for you, the same people who are driving for you, the same people who do your laundry, who take care of your kids, who do construction, who basically make the city of Miami run, these are the people who are getting sick, and if you don't do anything about it, you're gonna get sick in return. So the Miami Herald decided to agree to do an expose, and the first news article was actually published September 6, 1934. And I'm actually going to flip the camera around. I'm going to give you a glimpse of what this newspaper article looked like. So bear with me. All right. So the title of the article is Fertile Sources for Disease Breeding Within a Few Blocks of Downtown. And these are actual pictures of the colored town, and they specifically highlighted Good Bread Alley. And you see some of the how some of the infrastructures, as you can tell, I don't know if you really can tell, but that's actually a water bin. And if you see how some of the buildings were holded up, they were actually bricks holding up the foundations. And most of these buildings, although there were a few bricks, they were actually mostly made out of wood. And if you look down, if you were able to see closely, a lot of the floor, most of the floor was it was dirt floor. So since there was no running water, there was no sewer line, you know, people were forced to wash their hands, use the bathroom, all outside, all within like a couple of feet of their homes. So of course this was a fertile ground for disease and infection. And here you go. I'm going to show you a couple more articles. So at the Black Archives, we actually have an original article that was published in 1934 on one of the days of the expose. This was a 2 weeks expose covering the slum and blight conditions of Colored Town. And let me see, give me a second. All right. I have a lot of article, and we actually have an original issue, but it's actually pretty fragile. So we are very restricted of what we allow the public to see, since it needs to be handled with care. All right, give me 1 second. This is another newspaper article I'm pulling up, and it also shows you other housing and other buildings that were located in Colored Town, which is now known as Overtown. It says abominable is a description given to health menace area after survey. So because, let me flip this over. Hey guys, I'm back. Okay. Because of the deplorable condition and the 2 weeks expose, this actually captured national headlines and national attention. So Franklin D. Roosevelt actually sent members and delegation of the Public Works Administration to Miami to do a survey to see what can be done. So under Roosevelt's New Deal that was created in 1933, under Roosevelt's New Deal that was created in 1933, which was aimed to restore the U.S. economy and restore the infrastructure after the Great Depression. There was a lot of health programs, there was a lot of construction, there was a lot of public works programs that were funded by the government that were supposed to stimulate the economy and improve the living conditions for the U.S., but especially for African Americans. There is debate of whether how functional it was at the end. At the end, $6 billion was spent, but there was no sustainability after. You can read more about this topic, but under the New Deal and the Public Works Administration, a couple of programs were funded, a couple of big construction. And just to ask a couple of you, just to interact, does anybody else know, besides the Liberty Square project, what other public works were constructed under the New Deal and the Public Works Administration? I want to see if you guys know a little bit about that. So feel free to chime in. I'm going to give you a couple hints. So one of the big projects that they funded were dams, bridges, schools, housing complex. I-95, okay, so I got a comment. Ethan Payne said I-95. No, that was a little bit later. So I-95 started in the 1950s. The construction of highways was in the 1950s, especially I-95. That was enacted by the Florida State Road Department, specifically to the portion of Miami in 1956, but that's a little bit later. The New Deal actually ran from 1933 to 1939. So no, it's not I-95, but there's a couple big projects here in Florida. And I'm going to give you a hint. It has to do with Miami. I mean, with the Florida Keys. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds while I put up another article. Okay, Lewis, I see St. Matheson Hammock Park. So I don't have Matheson Hammock Park on my list, but actually it was the Overseas Highway Bridge. So the 7 Mile bridge that connects the Florida Keys to the mainland. That was one of the big projects, as well as the Hoover Dam. And you also have the Lincoln Tunnel in New York. That is right, Miss Brayden. It's a 7 Mile bridge. So yes. So the Public Works Administration was responsible for a lot of big construction, and it was responsible for the basically building and led up to the creation of the Liberty Square housing project. So after the delegation from the Public Works Administration came to Miami, did the survey, they decided they needed to do something about the slum and blight, because how can this happen in Miami's own backyard? What were the tourists going to think when they came to Miami to vacation? They could not have this sore eyes, be such a blemish on Miami. And at the Black Archives, we actually have some pretty actual original graphic illustration of how the administration used to advocate and promote for the construction of Liberty Square, and it's pretty interesting. So I really recommend you guys, when the archives reopens, to check out these collections, because these are original first source, primary source documents that are available and free to the public to see and to do research. So yes. So because of that, they decided to move Miami Central Negro District to the Liberty and construct the Liberty Square housing project. And let me just give you a brief article on that. Let me show you some of the people they sent to survey. But mind you, even though this newspaper article makes no mention of Reverend Comer, who had basically spearheaded this movement and spearheaded the poor living condition, or Kelsey Farr, they did make sure to highlight the workers of the Public Works Administration. So there you go. But the Miami Herald did not mention the very important work of Reverend John E. Comer. All right. So this is where I keep all my articles. As you can tell, I have a lot of them. So give me a second. Let me pull it up, what I'm looking for. Okay, this is it. All right. Sorry about that. So this article was published in September 13, 1936. And it talks about the construction of the Liberty Square housing project. It was to be completed December of that year. The Liberty Square housing project is often referred as the $1 million housing project because it cost $1 million to construct. And give me 1 second. Let me just flip my pages. Okay. So later that year, the Liberty Square housing project was completed, and it was, at the time, it was state-of-the-art. The buildings and the apartments were full concrete, and they also have waterproof insulation. And let me just flip this over back to me. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so let me just give you a brief rundown. So like I said, it was often referred as a $1 million housing project. It was planned that 243 families were to move in there. There were 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. The complex also had a clinic, a nursery, a community recreation hall, a kitchen, and a dining hall that was to be used by all. The housing opening ceremony was actually October 15th, 1936. And in May 16, 1937, it was actually highlighted and praised in the Architecture Design magazine. And it was praised for its state-of-the-art, one-of-a-kind building. that had running water, electricity, beautiful lawns, beautiful decors, and rents were as low as $2.85 per week for a 2-bedroom apartment. A 3-bedroom apartment would cost $3.73 for a week for a 3-bedroom apartment. The footing of the walls of the foundation were reinforced concrete. It was emulsified with waterproof on the inside extension with concrete block. The housing manager of the Liberty Square housing project was James E. Scott. Some of you might have heard of it. James E. Scott was a native Georgian that moved down to South Florida, and he became the housing project manager in 1936. He actually founded the Liberty Square Consumer Cooperative Association in 1939. He encouraged tenants to save money and invest in their own welfare. So James E. Scott encouraged the tenants to see how they could become homeowners themselves. A lot of the homeowners that move into, a lot of the tenants that move into the Liberty Square housing projects were teachers, lawyers. They were teachers, lawyers, middle class, working class, and families. And let's see. But this did not come without any complications. There was a lot of complication and reluctance to the building of the Liberty Square housing project, and there was a lot of pushback from the white residents in the surrounding Liberty City area. In 1939, June 22nd, 1939, there was a proposal to extend the Liberty Square housing project for another 40 or so apartments. But the white residents in the surrounding Liberty City area, they opposed it. For them, it was too close to the colored line. They couldn't accept it. Let's see. There was a buffer zone between 12th and 13th Avenue, and that was if they were going to build the extension of the housing project, it was going to get closer to the white line, and they said they couldn't do that. They needed a buffer zone. They needed to keep something in between the white and black neighborhoods. There were already a lot of racial incidents that were captured in Miami Herald newspaper articles, and also other newspaper articles in South Florida, including let's see, there was a lot of complaints by the white residents around the area complaining about speeding, the noise, little thing that you can think of. And there was also a lot of assaults that the black residents faced themselves. So this was a big problem for both communities. So what was proposed was to leave those there was approximately 20 acres between 12th and 13th Avenue, was to leave it vacant. But however, in July 19, 1939, Harold Stewart, the architect for the Liberty Square housing project, explained that there was going to be a barrier erected, and that the U.S. Housing Authority authorized the completion of the additional units in order to satisfy the residents in the area. They agreed to expand 12th Avenue to 70 feet and then also raise it 2 feet in elevation. And then on top of that, they were also gonna, so on top of that, on 12th Street, they were planning to construct a parkway planted with Australian pine hedge. So these pine hedge, when they were going to be planted, they were approximately 6 feet in height, but they would eventually grow to 20 feet in height. And then on top of that, in order to create an additional barrier, they were also going to plant these gumbo limbo trees in the middle of the parkway that were eventually going to reach 20 feet. Okay, I'm back. The video paused. Okay, so I was just talking about how by the late 1930s, Liberty Square was already constructed. There was plan to expand Liberty Square for additional housing complex, housing units, apartments, but the white residents in the surrounding Liberty Square, Liberty City area, they were complaining because it was too close to the color line, and they did not want the Liberty Square housing projects to expand. So in conclusion, they decided the only alternative was to build a basically a 70-foot barrier between the two communities. So this barrier was going to be 70 foot in length. It was going to be the dividing line, and within this parkway, they were going to plant these big Australian pine trees all along the parkway in order to create this barrier. The pine trees were eventually going to be growing to 12. It was going to eventually grow to 20 feet high, and they also were going to plant some other different trees in order to make sure there was an additional barrier by landscape. And on top of that, a 4-foot wall was going to be erected along the Liberty Square housing project to basically support the landscape barrier. And at the end of it, 12th Avenue was only to be used by white, whereas 12th Court was to only be used by colored. So those are a lot of things I did not know about. I knew about the Liberty Square walls. The Liberty Square wall, I'm going to get to more about it in its history, its duration in next week's session, part 2, because I just really want to make sure I cover all my bases. I knew about the wall, but I did not know that there was designation of the different streets because of the Liberty Square housing project. I didn't know that 12th Avenue was only to be used by whites, whereas 12th Court was only to be used by colored. And I actually found an article related to the wall. So there's not a lot of pictures related to the Liberty Square walls. The pictures that we have, the black archives, and a lot of the pictures that I've seen was already when the wall was torn down during the Civil Rights Movement. And I have not yet seen the picture of the wall when it was fully erect, but I was really excited excited to find this piece of information talking about the actual wall, to get how tall was the wall, that information, because that's not something I came across before. Give me a second. I see a comment by Ms. Patricia Brainan. She says they also had a deed restriction on the east side of the wall, which I'm not surprised. Let's see. Give me a second. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Alright, so I'm going to flip the camera over, guys. Okay. So this is a news article published July 16, 1939. And it says, buffer strip arrangement for housing project outlined by architect. Harold Stewart, architect on the project, explained that on the barrier problem between the second addition to Liberty City and the present white settlement on Northwest 12th Avenue as dividing line, the U.S. Housing Authority have authorized completion of a plan dedicated 35 feet from the east boundary of the government property to the city for the proposed widening 12th Avenue to a 70-foot street, which 12th Avenue will be an average of 2 feet higher in elevation than 12th Court, which in the Housing Authority is creating on the west side of 12th Avenue. Between these two thoroughfares will be constructed a parkway planted with Australian pine hedge 6 feet high, which on the course of a few years will be 20 feet high, which in the which should be 20 feet high. Give me a second. Oh, the letters are so tiny that my eyes are like okay. Okay, similar to hedge surrounding Hialeah racetrack. In addition to the Australian hedge will be planted gumbo limbo trees 20 feet on the center. In addition to this planted hedge and trees across will be a 4-foot concrete retaining wall placed between the two avenues, which will prevent intercommunication by the whites and colored section. In fact, the street in Liberty City will be dead end at 12th Court, and at 12th Avenue only be used by white people, and by 12th court only be used by colored people. So this is a mock-up drawing of how it would be proposed to look. So you see here to the right, they have the colored section with the trees planted, and then the other, not according to scale, but the wide gap in between the road, and then you also see the other section. So yeah. All right. I know in the beginning I went over about the living conditions in Overtown, which led to the creation of the Liberty Square housing project, and I actually wanted to show you some pictures of the shotgun houses that were located in Overtown. So this is a better picture than the grainy one that you saw on the Miami Herald expose. So these pictures are a little bit later in year, older than the expose, but they're essentially the same shotgun houses that existed at the time. This is another one. So as you can see, it's a wooden structure. They're called shotgun houses because they're very narrow, and it is said that a person could stand in the middle of the house and they can extend their arms laterally. They could touch the building that was right next to them. They were really close to one another. And then you also see that a lot of these buildings were actually held up by concrete blocks. And if you can tell, the floors were actually dirt floors. There was no running water or electricity or stores. So if you were a native Miamian, I can imagine how the summers were, or the living conditions were. All right. And then, all right. Oh yeah. So this is a bit of random information, but during my research, I actually found that in 1937, the Duke and Duchess were invited to Miami to see the Liberty Square housing project, and this was the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. So this was the Duke that resigned. He was next in line, but he resigned because he married an American socialite and divorcee. I thought that was just really odd and interesting that they were invited to see Liberty Square housing project. And then also these were, let me see. Oh, yes. I also want to mention that because of the Liberty Square housing project and how it was rated to be one of the most modern housing places right after they were built, there was actually a big outcry by the white community saying that they needed their own housing projects, that they needed to be able to afford the same affordable housing as the tenants that were living in Liberty Square. So that led to the creation of the Miami Edison Square housing project, which was the white housing project. So I found that interesting. All right. So for today's session, I'm going to end it there. So we're up to the point of the basically 1940s. For next week's session, I'm going to continue on to 1940s all the way to now, to what is going on with Liberty Square now. I decided to divide it up to two different sessions, so since there was so much information, I did not want to forget anything, forget not to mention anything. But yes. Okay, so we do have a question. It says, where is Edison Square? So give me 1 second. I am actually gonna give you the exact address. Give me 1 second. And if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to leave a comment, and I am gonna answer it. Give me a second. If you have any questions, any comments, or anything about that, please feel free to answer. Let me give you, Ethan, I'm working on your answer. It's from Edison High School. So Miss Patricia Breenan is awesome, and she answered it's across from Edison High School, but let me give you, if I can give you the exact address. Okay. So it is, okay, so Edison Square is just north of Edison High School on 62nd Street. And if you're not familiar with the Miami area, Miami Edison and the Liberty City area was originally a white neighborhood. And when Liberty Square was created, that changed the demographic. And you do see, I'm going to talk about it in the next section, you're going to see that white flight because of the construction of Liberty Square, and then also the construction and also the home ownership and buying from colored residents in the area. And it says, who decided to take down the wall during the civil rights movement? Okay, so I'm going to get to that in the second half of this session. It's going to be next week, so tune in next week, Monday at 1 p.m. It's extensive, so I don't want to miss anybody. I don't want to miss any points, so I'm going to be answering that the second half, which is next week. So stay tuned. I'm going to answer that next week. This is part 1 of part 2. So yes. So if anybody else has any other questions, any comments, let me see if I can show you more pictures. And it's really interesting to know also that, you know, you can't talk about Liberty Square housing projects without talking about the condition that was going on, the slum and blight conditions that were going on in Colortown. And, you know, it's crazy how they describe the slum condition of Colortown, because they're actually, the Miami Herald actually quoted that says, residents of the Negro section are the creatures of the conditions, They little to do but help themselves. You know, they don't do anything but to help themselves. But then you also think about, who are the owners of these houses? Who are the owners of the shotgun houses? Who are the owners of the housing complex in Colortown? A lot of the owners were whites. There were whites that increased their rent periodically, that charged twice what other for the same living basically living layouts. They double the prices in Colortown than they would have at other sections of Miami. And basically, since there were colored residents who were the tenants, no one said anything, no one did anything, and these white owners did little to fix the living conditions of their tenants. There was a lot of well-known white owners, and one of them, who's a controversial figure, is L.L. Brooks, and that's another session, another topic that either myself or one of my other colleagues can talk about it. But it's really interesting to talk about it. You can't talk about Liberty Square without talking about Reverend John E. Coomer. You can't talk about Liberty Square without talking about Overtown. You can't talk about Liberty Square without talking about, you know, the Jim Crow laws or the living conditions that were experienced by the black tenants, by the colored residents in Miami. And it says, Ms. Brandon says, thank you. Thank you for always tuning in, Ms. Brandon. She also said, also with a deed restriction, you were limited to where you could move. Yes. And banks also did not loan to blacks. And that, yeah, banks did not only loan to blacks. We actually have a lot of great collections that talk about, you know, banks who did not loan to blacks. So that's another interesting topics that we hope we can also expand and talk about. And with this, I also want to show you, you know, there are so many restrictions that we can go on and on for days, but I actually have this in my USB. This was part of one of my brown bag lunch series when talking about Overtown. So in order to cross, let me see if I can enlarge it. So because of Jim Crow laws, colored residents in Miami were restricted to where they can go, where they can live, and where they can work, and everything else in between. And let's say if you were a person of color, and you worked in Miami Beach, or you worked in other areas, like Miami Beach, the white section of Coral Gables, in order to move across the color line, you needed an identification card. And at the Black Archives, we actually have a couple of identification cards. And I actually want to give you a glimpse of it. I'm not going to show you the complete or full good image of it because, you know, these are real identification cards, and it does have the names of people and things like that. And because of that, I'm making an alteration and modification where you really can't see much, and just to be respectful to the family. So, but if you go do research at the Black Archives, you're going to be able to see them. So let me show you this. So I'm going to just back it up a little bit. So this is what an identification card looked like. It basically had the name of the person, where they were working at, where they lived, and if you're a person of color, that's what you needed to carry with you if you wanted to move across the color line. So just gonna show you that really quick. But there's so many different topics and so many conversation, you know, Liberty Square does bring up. All right, guys. So sorry for that close up on my face. So with that being it, if you guys have any other questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to chime in. I'm going to stay on a couple more minutes. And I hope to see you. I hope you guys join me next week for part 2 of the Liberty Square housing projects. And I'm going to be talking about the history from 1940 to modern day. And I'm going to plan to cover, answer some of the questions that were asked today that I could not get to today. So I hope you guys join me. And thank you guys. See you next week. All right.